Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining me at another episode of Back to Basics Practice Management and Operations. I am your host, Sharon Johnson from Train 51 Consulting. So I'm excited to have with us today our special guest, Tressa Harley from MD Office Insights, and we will be talking all things AR reconciliation. So let me give you a brief background about Tressa. Tressa is a payer relations expert and provider reimbursement coach. She is a healthcare consultant who leads accomplished medical practice managers and healthcare administrators through their challenges with health insurers using sustainable, simplified solutions that work. Practice managers call when they're drowning in claim denials and at their wits' end with health insurance companies. Tressa is the founder and CEO of MD Office Insights, a payer relations strategy firm known for transforming medical practices who feel as if they are at the mercy of health insurers into profitable entities that maximize reimbursement or control. Drawing on her unique experiences, she's gained over 2 decades as a health insurance leader. Tressa has firsthand knowledge of the inner workings of commercial payers, from decision making at the C suite level through execution at the front line level. Tressa's client work and expertise span to claim operations, provider contracting, utilization management, credentialing, provider appeals, provider servicing, network operations and servicing, member servicing, and more. So, this advantage gives her an unparalleled mastery in understanding how to remove the numerous disadvantages providers face with payers. I'm sure all the practice managers and administrators out there can relate to what Tressa's background have been and have we been discussing thus far. So at the conclusion of our session today, we will have, if you want to learn more about Tressa's results-oriented methodology to maximize provider reimbursement using 90% strategy and 10% effort, we will have her contact information. I'm also going to add that in the comments so that in case that you want to reach out to her, it will also be there. So let's, without further ado, dive into this topic and let's bring on Tressa Harley. Good morning, Tressa. How are you?
Good morning. How are you? I'm well, thank you.
I was just going through, your bio, and I thought, oh boy, some of these topics are very, very familiar to us that are practice managers or had been practice managers at one point, practice administrators. The things that they're, like you said, succinctly said in your bio.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. So first of all, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about such a complex topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just, when we talk about provider and payer relations, I think one of the things that kind of goes unstated is that it's every single touch point that providers have with payers. It's not just denied claims, it's every touch point. So every phone call, every email, every meeting, all of it. So I really like when I get the opportunity to kind of share, all this knowledge that I've accumulated for a very long time, and just kind of break down and make it super simple, like just a lot of these complex concepts and topics that come out of provider and payer relations.
And you definitely hit the nail on the head. They are very complex, and there are things that I can't wait for you to break it down for us.
Yeah.
So let's dive into that. And I'm
Okay.
so grateful that you're my guest, and thank you. So what are the common pitfalls to look out for, to detect issues with AR? What should we be
So,
focusing
yeah. So, one of the first key indicators that you're definitely going to look for are your front end denials, when they account for more than 10% of your denials. Front end denials are the denials that, believe it or not, you have the most control over. And these denials really happen on the intake part of the process when a claim comes in. So, the plans, the way they look at this is they say, okay, we all we did was transmit the claim. All we did, that's the only piece. They haven't gone through any of their claim edits or anything yet, which is why when it comes to the front end denials, they tend to not offer medical review or any substantial reviews for those, because again, they haven't really touched it. Those all happen on the intake process. So anytime, number one, you've got front end denials that are, again, more than probably about 10% of your entire denial inventory, that's a key pitfall that you want to look for. Another pitfall that you might want to look for would be any patterns and things that just kind of don't make sense within your inventory. So let's say you have a situation like an annual routine physical to PCP, and it denies for lack of authorization or exceeds the number of visits, just a denial that doesn't really make sense. When those things, and then they start to accumulate in volume in your inventory. And so you want to catch those things kind of early and report them kind of early, because they definitely need a detailed investigation, and that needs to happen on the plan's part. And right now, it's not uncommon for issues like that to go 7, 9, 11 months even.
Mm.
And again, if you're not part of that process, if you're not involved with it, and if you don't report it very quickly, it has the potential to balloon from maybe what starts out as a 4 or 5 figure issue to a 6 or a 7 figure issue.
Oh, wow.
So that's another pitfall you want to look for. And a less obvious one, but more important, is you want to take inventory of how many times it actually takes to resolve a single claim.
Mm.
And that's from the time the claim hits your list to how many calls are being made on it. Does it eventually wind up being appealed? Like, kind of what's the life cycle before you decide you're okay with the denial, or the denial is what it is, or you wind up having to write it off? How many times, how many contacts and touch points are you making for
Mm.
that particular claim? And here's the reason why that matters, because the multiple touch points, obviously, they're not great, but it suggests that either it wasn't directed to the correct decision maker the first
Mm.
time,
Mm.
or maybe it was never even eligible for reimbursement. There's
Mm.
also the possibility that things got lost in the translation. And that's actually a big one also, because what happens is provider will say something. When the plan gets it, they hear it, or they're investigating something else. And then there's a lot of going back and forth about a concern, and it may not even, you might actually not even really be touching on the root cause. And I've seen many instances where in fact the claim never gets resolved, even though it could have been probably at the first step. So if I had to say, those are probably my top 3 pitfalls.
Wow, and you just educated me on just the cycle of, the touch points and things like that. And I think you're right. That seems to be the lesser of, the things that you detect, and that's very interesting. So, having said all those common pitfalls, what are the best practice for AR reconciliation? Because obviously that's something in the practice that is in existence for as long as the practice is continuing to see patients and providing services and so on. There were always going to be a claim and reimbursement and whatnot. So, what are some of the best practices that we can, the practices can do for themselves to make sure that they're on top of the AR reconciliation. They're looking at it. There's things like that. Like, what are some of the best things that they should do in order to keep up with that?
Okay. So that's that. I've got a really easy way to do this, right? But let me
Okay.
start with this. The way this looks actually for most practices is that it actually starts with a list of denials. The denials then get distributed. And of course, you sort them by plan. But then from there, practices have multiple different ways that they sort of sort the denials.
Mhm.
Some sort by age, some sort by the dollar amount.
Mm.
But the best practice, honestly, is to group or sort by the denial type.
Okay.
And the reason that I do it like this is because when it comes to reconciling, it is actually the same process. When you group by denial type, it's the same process for every single payer. Now, there's a whole backstory as to how that got to be, and I'll spare
Mhm.
you all of those details. But
I'm sure there is, no doubt.
yeah. It's a civil suit that was brought against every single insurance company in the
Mm,
U.S. So, like I
mm,
said, there's a whole backstory, but the reality is this: when you sort by denial type, number one, there's consistency because you can use the same process for every plan, and secondly, you can start to address multiple claims at the same time. So when I say group by denial type, let's just kind of unpack that for a little bit.
mhm.
So claim denials happen in one of three places. The first thing is it goes through, as I said, as I mentioned earlier, the intake process. So this is where you see what are called front end denials or soft denials.
Mhm.
And these are things like lack of authorization, lack of referral, timely filing.
Yeah.
And all of that you kind of want to put into one pile. And typically, when you're looking at things in this particular segment, oftentimes denials are inadvertently being created, and um, it generally speaks to an operational or workflow process,
Mm.
and that's it. And this is where the thing is, if it's operational or workflow process, you actually have the most control over that because, again, all the variables typically are going to be within the office. Okay.
Yep.
So I'm going to give you an example of that. So let's take an OB office, for example, where a patient, they call, they make their appointment, they say, here's what I'd like to see the doctor about. The patient gets into the room with the physician and they present with a situation where an auth is needed.
Okay.
Of course, only the physician can make that determination. The patient, of course, didn't know that. And in this position, the patient's in the office, and so you don't have time to get the authorization up front.
Right.
So now, in that case, some offices will automatically they go, okay, we couldn't get the auth, we'll try to appeal. Or I've also heard other situations where they'll ask the patient to, they'll have the patient just kind of wait in the office
Mhm.
until they can get the authorization, or they have the patient come back when they can get the authorization ahead of time. Now, none of those are actually great scenarios. And again, it's not the office's fault, it's not the patient's fault, but it is a workflow problem that can absolutely be mitigated on the provider end. Okay. Again, that claim could easily deny, or that service could deny for no auth. But again, plans are just looking at it from the denial aspect, and they're looking at it very black and white. And auth was there or it wasn't.
Right.
So that's an example of kind of the front end denials. And like I said, we can work around those. And that's a pretty common one. So if you have all your front end denials in one pile, again, let's look at those. And then you can start to see, okay, what happened? What can we do in our workflow to kind of help reduce the amount of these denials? So then that second pile would be your billing. And this is where we talk about code to code relationships and the actual billing that's on the claim. So in this bucket, you're going to see denials like incidental. You're going to see denials like mutually exclusive or anything related to a modifier. Now,
Right.
these types of denials, they typically require a little bit of research, but the good news is plans have the guidelines for the associated services posted on their website. It's going to be either at the service level or at the code level. And once you know the policies, or at least know where to go to get the policies around your most frequently billed codes, the good news is, again, they don't change very often that you're not able to keep up. So it becomes really easy to get familiar with what a plan is looking for, whether it's certain, whatever the billing guidelines are, when it's appropriate to bill that, if it's a modifier related issue, if they're looking for previous history or something like that that was billed on a previous claim. So again, the answer is kind of out there, but like I said, it takes a little bit of investigation. But once you kind of are familiar with where to look, it becomes really easy to to plow through those denials and to establish if the service is going to be, if it's even eligible for reimbursement.
And
Go ahead.
real quickly, in the is that in the provider network, so to speak? Like they have like these onlines where they show you, oh, you can access the health plan policy here at the portal or something, and then you can look at that. Is that someplace where they can also take a gander?
Yes, that's
That's-
exactly where it is.
okay.
Yes. And it's very easy to just set up links. So whatever it looks like for your office, whether you have remote billers or billers that are in-house, in person, you can just set up links for that. So they should have easy, quick access links for any of that. And like I said, most practices, you tend to have certain codes that you bill on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you look at your denials, it's really easy to look at your reporting and kind of pull out what are the most frequently denied services and quickly go through and find what the guidelines are for that particular service. And again, as it relates to kind of those billing denials that I talked about, most that's in the guidelines around that service. So you're always looking for it at the service level.
Got it.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
And then the third type of denial that I mentioned would be the clinical denials. And this is where you're looking at denials like medical necessity, potentially cosmetic. And once again, similar to the billing, these are all related to the medical policy. So again, plans publish that on their site. And you need that. And you also want to make sure that your medical documentation supports the medical policy. That's very key. And I'm going to break down why. So, of the three denials, of those front end denials, of the billing denials, and of these clinical denials, the clinical ones are the ones that are associated with the highest dollars. So, from a value perspective, this is the category that it really is worth your time to dispute, but also to do the research. And when you're disputing them, you always, your argument, for example, or your appeal should always be crafted around what the medical policy is and how the case did in fact support the medical policy and where that information can be found and how that's displayed in the supporting documentation. And you also want to be clear about that the plan didn't identify that. Now, I often see providers approaching their appeals or their disputes from the perspective of results, where they talk about, well, we followed this protocol and we got faster results, or there's all this great documentation that we're seeing from these new techniques and we're eager to try them. And while I think we can all agree, right, that all that should be absolutely taken into consideration. The reality is the bottom line decision, whether that service gets paid or not, is based on the medical policy. So it's really important to know ahead of time that the policy actually supports that service. So again, just to kind of quickly recap, the best practice is to make sure that you're reconciling your denials by the denial type. So a front end denial, it could be simple adjustments to your workflow. Your billing and your clinical denials, you have clear guidelines as to what the plan will and won't pay for. But most importantly, you really do get to address multiple claims at the same time.
Wow. So
yeah.
So really what I heard is that your billing and your clinical are the ones that you're going to spend more time really doing the investigation, really doing the work that at hand, but also just for for knowledge base, to look at it. It's there, published by the health plan. One of the things that you want to at least get into is while is of the essence for the practice, and time is often a challenge, I think that what I hear you saying is that for things that are commonly that you code for, or things that are, repetitive procedures, things that are somewhat repetitive, you can glean to see where that is in the health plan from their guidelines. I think I heard that. I think that's helpful, because then it's going to happen. It's
Yeah.
repetitive. It's something that happens. So I think if we can help to reduce that, from a clinical or billing, potential pitfall, we can at least be proactive and have already that. And the things that are coming in new, or things that are coming in, is something that requires even more. So either way, there's investigation, but there's also, I think, a proactive sense of what the practice can do based on what they do for services that are repeated, or codes that are repeatable, and things that they use.
Yes. And, the reality is this: plans, there's a lot of information. If you go on a plan's website, there is an overwhelm of information, and you don't know where to start, and you don't know where to look. And so that's why, particularly when it comes to reconciliation, the first thing you want to start with are, as I said, are the most common denials. What are the things you most frequently bill? When I work with clients, one of the first things that I typically see, like I said, are those patterns. It's the same thing kind of over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really about, okay, you can really develop a workflow that makes it simple for your team around just the common things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that. We start with the simple,
Yeah.
and spread out to the complex.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I think also we think about time management, that if we spend time with the ones that are challenging, and the ones that are simple, that we can kind of be able to deal with. So my third question is, what type of like audit can a physician practice do, when they're working with, let's say they're working with a medical billing vendor, to ensure that they're maximizing their AR. They may not have like internal resources, and they're outsourcing that. But in the meantime, also for what the practice also needs to be aware of, and also put some kind of action. What kind of audit, just for making sure that things are still running smoothly, the relationship, and then the communication between billing and practice, and things like that.
Yeah, so the biggest indicator would actually be looking at your denial rate over time. And what I mean by this is, so if you're working with a vendor, you want to look at, when you started with this vendor, what was your denial rate? Did that denial rate increase or decrease? Either way, one of the first things you want to know is why. What contributed to those numbers, whether they got better or whether they decreased. Now, the reality is, plans, they change policies, they
Mm-hmm.
change guidelines
Mm-hmm.
all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So just because you see an increase in your denial rate doesn't necessarily mean that the biller is not doing their job. The key there, though, is that you want them to be able to explain what they're seeing.
Okay. Okay.
That's a big part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so, obviously, if you are seeing improved numbers, you also want to still have that conversation. You want to know, why did it improve? What's happened? Is it because something they did identify a certain way to bill? Is it because the medical documentation has gotten better? Are they submitting corrected claims? Those are all important things. You also want to be able to set certain progress markers. So again, how many times are they actually touching a claim before it gets paid? Or how many times are they touching a claim in general in an attempt to get it paid? So
Mm.
once again, is there something that maybe could have been identified a little bit earlier? Like I said, what's their process to go through and to actually evaluate and research these claims? But the dialogue is a key part of kind of that audit. Now, realistically, I think most of the people in the audience know zero denials is not a thing. So you're never going to get to
Zero.
yeah,
Yes.
you're never going to get to zero. You'll get to zero in terms of investigation and how quickly
Mm,
you're researching and going through, whether it's outsourcing or whether you're looking at it internally in your own office, whether that function rests in your office. But zero denials is not actually a thing. You also want to look at if your denial rate has plateaued.
mm,
Again, you also want to look at was there a change in policy? Is there something that you can do? Does the coding on the claim accurately represent the rendered services? And in those cases, I would also go back to depending on if it's been a while, at least if
mm,
it's been a year, I would
mhm.
go back to the policy and I would see, has anything changed in that policy that you may or may not be aware of? Because again, that could or could not be in your favor, but you don't know if you don't look at the policy. And then I also think that understanding kind of the financial ROI in terms of what's their process. We've seen some of the larger billing companies. We've seen some of them where their process is to appeal 100%
Mm.
of all the denials. Like that's their research process, that's their dispute process, which it's not very effective. I'm going to just say that. It's not effective at all. That doesn't change just because you inundate a plan with paper.
Gotcha.
So it really is about having a clear and clean strategy
Mhm.
to get things overturned, but also, as I said before, just kind of understanding if things are even eligible for reimbursement. And so, to your question about how to audit your billing, whether it's in-house or
Mhm.
externally,
Mhm.
you want to look at, like I said, that denial rate, and you want to be able to understand what's driving the denials that are in your inventory, and that should be a very clear explanation. It should not be anything that's super detailed.
Gotcha. So, in terms of frequency, because I think, I like what you said about having a dialogue and,
Yeah.
dialogues. And, again, if you're going to outsource your billing, or even if you have it in house and you've created that, particular resource for your practice, for some, that when is that dialogue? Like, is that like a monthly, quarterly, just to be able to have some checkpoints and also garner, based on that what you said, denial rate. Okay, so this is what happened, in the quarter, and have the discussion of, all those points that we were talking about. And again, some of it is awareness, but also some of it is, just awareness and education, but also here's what here's what we're planning to do to mitigate, like that kind of conversation.
Yes.
How often should that be? Is that a quarterly, a monthly? Like, what's the, a good cadence? And again, I'm not in favor of meeting just to be meeting if you don't have the
Correct.
information, to garner from. That's a wasteful meeting. You're wasting
Yes.
everybody's time. But I think that if you can bring to the table, in a good month, monthly, again, monthly, quarterly, or semi-annual, however they want to do that, to give them a data. Like, your data will show you, and I think it's really important for practices to really get into the data pieces, that to
Yes.
tell them, where we are and how we need to go, because it will say that, your numbers are not going to tell you anything differently unless someone's cooking your books. But other
Right.
than that, I think that your data is going to tell you, oh, hey, here's your denial rate, here's what's kind of happening, et cetera, et cetera.
So I like quarterly to start with. Obviously that changes, and the reason I suggest quarterly is typically with most plans, it could take up to about 90 days before you start to
Mhm.
see changes, and particularly if you're implementing a new process. So you definitely want to give that time to take root, and you want to have enough data, to your point, to have some meaningful conversation and to have some meaningful dialogue. So for sure, I would start with quarterly. That way, if something is working, if something's not working, you've got kind of the telltale signs right there after with a good solid 90 days. And then you can kind of decide whether you want to keep on that track or whether you want to change and try something a little bit different. So I think quarterly is a really, really good start. If it's in-house,
Mm-hmm.
once you have a stable process and you're
Mm-hmm.
comfortable with your billing process,
Mm-hmm.
then I would actually move to monthly check-ins. And the reason, again, you want to kind of go to the monthly check-in is because you need a 2 minute or maybe a 30-second, yes, everything's still fine, or here's what we're seeing that's looking a little bit different. As I said, if you start to find patterns and things that are creeping up, you want to catch them early, because again, you don't want something that starts at, 4 figures to turn into something that's 7 figures because you didn't identify it quickly enough and you thought, it was just something small. Yeah. So then you want to do that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And do you recommend a baseline data to start with? Kind of like where they are in their denial rate. Like here's where we started with, and then if they're working to implement a change in flow or things like that, and then go back to it to say here's where we started and how we've improved. Would you recommend like a baseline?
Yeah, so you should definitely. So there's not a specific number that I would recommend because it looks different for every practice.
Sure, sure.
But yes, you do definitely want to identify what your starting point is. And again, it comes down to, I think, from a reconciliation point, what each of those buckets looks like. So, are you dealing with more front end denials? Are you dealing with more clinical denials? Are you dealing with more billing denials? And that kind of from there, I think it makes sense to kind of set whatever your goal is. You
Hmm.
can't, again, you kind of need that data to your point about the reporting. You need that data to be able to identify what's a reasonable goal to get to in terms of your denials.
Yeah, no, I like, well, I love all the conversation that you have. I think these
Yeah.
are strategies that are practical that can be implemented at the practice. Take time to really review. I think that's the other parts too. You want to review uh, your what's currently happening, what's
Yeah.
happening currently, and then what it sounds to me that what you've explained to us in terms of information that we can glean upon. And again, it would be something that what based on what's happening, we can take, okay, let's look at front end, let's look at billing, let's look at clinical, and then from those buckets, I like the buckets because then you
Yeah.
can at least figure out that you have bucket A, bucket one, bucket two, bucket three,
Yes.
and then you can move along, it sounds like, from each bucket. And as you're identifying which ones that I need to spend time on, bucket two,
Yes.
bucket three, bucket one, I might just need a couple days because this is something that we can resolve from a front
Right.
end side. So I like
Yes.
the buckets definitely.
And
Well,
as I said, it works across every plan. So you don't have, this person working with this blue and they've got one process they're doing. And then you've got somebody working with another big plan, Aetna, and they've got another process. No, every plan, their denials will fall into one of those three buckets. And the answer and how to resolve it is, again, it's the same across every single plan.
Well, that's even better because then that's
Yeah.
universal. It's a
Yeah.
universal approach, and it's not anything that you have to distinguish between the plans. And really, if you're looking at it as you're sorting it, if they're all the same process, all the same thing universally, then your buckets would, you can work your buckets in the way through that. So you're not complicating it. It's a very streamlined way of looking at things, and you're really looking at every single plan. You're not,
Yeah.
like you said, you're not saying, oh, this is Aetna, this is Blue Cross, this is Humana, this is Cigna. You have everything there. It's just your buckets are going to be filled in what they are from the AR reconciliation of front end billing and clinical. I
Yes.
really like this. This is like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness. I mean, if anyone is listening to us as managers and administrators, if that was a eureka moment for you, it was definitely one of those things where I think we just, Tressa just gave you keys to the health plan kingdom, if
Yeah.
you will, at least in the sense of how we need to work those denials and whatnot. So how do
Yes.
we reach you? What's the best way? If we have any additional questions and things like that. Obviously, we talked about this in the high level, but each
Yes.
practice has their own nuances depending on their specialties. And so what's the best way for any of the practices to contact you?
Yeah. So if you want more information or to get in touch with me, you can reach me at my website, which is mdofficeinsights.com. You can also reach me at my email, which is Tressa, Tressa, at mdofficeinsights.com.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you so much. I thank you for being our special guest. I learned tremendously. I hope
Good.
that our listeners, again, I go back to the practice managers, administrators, if there are physicians that also are, been exposed to some of this information within your practice, I highly recommend some of those tips and really review and look at, what you have at your practice. And if any of the information that Tressa have provided that can be taken and implemented or applied to what we're doing, please do. And if you have further information, please reach out to Tressa. I learned a whole lot. I
Yeah, I'm
learned.
glad. I'm glad.
Well, again, thank you for being our guest, and I
Yes.
hope you have a great weekend.
All right. Thank you.